And now Magnus, queen c2, giving up the pawn on a5 and expanding in the center. He wants to win at all costs. In this video, Magnus Carlsen shocks Magnus Carlsen by losing to Alireza Firouzja in a twist ending in the 2024 Global Chess League. Now in the game, Magnus opens 1d4, d5 by Alireza, and Magnus goes for the queen's gambit, and the queen's gambit declined for Alireza Firouzja. Now knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, the classical three knights variation of the queen's gambit decline. And now Alireza goes for the most combative idea, the Semi-Slav with the move c6. Of course, the main idea in this variation, black is threatening the move d takes c4 and maybe hanging on to the pawn with the move b5. So how does Magnus combat this idea? In the game, he does not go for the main line starting with bishop g5 or e3. Instead, he throws a curveball with the sideline g3. This move is in the spirit of the Catalan Opening, and Magnus has been playing a ton of the Catalan lately, so really not that big of a surprise. Now Alireza d takes c4 on the board. This is the strongest move, just winning the pawn on the c4 square. And of course now with that bishop going to g2, instead of staying on this diagonal, it is going to be a lot harder for white to win back that pawn. Alright, Magnus Carlsen, bishop g2, knight d7 by Alireza Firouzja, and now a4, expanding on the queen side. Magnus does not want to allow b5 ideas from black. And of course now b5 would be a massive mistake. White just takes twice with the a-pawn and then with the knight. So you obviously cannot do that. Now here in this position, black's main idea is just to continue developing, getting the dark squared bishop out into the game and then short castling on the king's side. So where is the bishop going to go? In the game, Alireza Firouzja plays the more passive idea, bishop b7. Instead, now that white went a2 to a4, bishop b4 is actually the strongest move, capitalizing on the weakened b4 square. Now instead, bishop e7 on the board, and now castles, and a5 by Magnus, just expanding on the queen side. Maybe he even wants to go a6 in the future, so we'll have to wait and see what he has in mind. Now here, black goes knight d5, offering the trade of knights. Of course, knight takes d5, not a possibility for Magnus. Then black just recaptures with a c-pawn, and he gets rid of his double pawns on the c-file, so that would be an absolute disaster. Here, Magnus instead, he expands on the king side with the move h4. And this is a move that Magnus absolutely loves to play in pretty much any position with his bishop on g2. He just loves it. The idea being the pawn controls the g5 square, setting up knight g5, maybe knight g5 and queen c2 ideas in the future, targeting that weak pawn on h7. Now here, Alireza, he goes bishop b4. Now, this is a weak move here. Instead, if he wanted to play this, he had to play it immediately instead of going bishop e7 first, then bishop b4. Of course, the idea behind this move is targeting that weak pawn on the a5 square. However, this move is a little bit slow, and Magnus does find a way to capitalize on that. Here, bishop g5 is the move, targeting the queen on the d8 square. Now the black queen has to move, or he has to block it, and there are a few main ideas. Queen c7 is possible. The good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6 is also possible. Again, Ben Feingold, a big fan of this move. But instead, the move played in the game by Alireza Firouzja is the move knight 7 to f6. Simply blocking the attack on the queen, and for now, black is doing perfectly fine. Now here, Magnus, obviously, he has to find something to do about that attack on the a5 pawn. For example, he can defend it with the move queen to a4. The queen will be reasonably active there, putting pressure on the bishop. However, instead, Magnus has a completely different idea in mind. In these Catalan-style positions, Magnus Carlsen absolutely loves to sacrifice a pawn to get an attack going in the center and on the king side, and that is exactly what he does right here. He starts with the move queen c2, getting the queen off the d-file. Maybe he wants to bring a rook there next, and beyond that, he's also setting up e4 ideas. So now black takes the pawn on the a5 square, likely the best move, but now e4 by Magnus, expanding in the center, and now after bishop takes and b takes c3, and then finally knight to e7, here Magnus Carlsen, he has exactly what he wants. He has a Catalan-style position against a Semi-Slav. He has those pawns on d4 and e4, and he has good attacking chances against the black king. So, I mean, this is just a dream scenario for Magnus Carlsen in this position. All right, now Magnus, he continues to increase the pressure. Knight to e5, jumping forward with the knight and preparing other ideas, as we'll see. All right, black here, b5, expanding on the queen side. Good move, trying to bolster that pawn on the c4 square. Of course, one of the ideas of knight to e5 is you are targeting that pawn on the c4 square with the knight. If you win back that pawn, you're going to have just a dominant position with that strong pawn center. So b5 defends the pawn on the b4 square. Good move. However, the drawback of this is it does weaken the c6 square. So now that knight on e7 is basically forced to defend it for now. And here Magnus shows another idea in this position. Queen to c1. Kind of a weird undeveloping move. Magnus Carlsen just loves these undeveloping queen moves. And of course, the idea behind it, he wants to bring the queen over to the f4 square on this diagonal. So as we'll see, this is what happens. Here, Alireza Firouzja plays king to h8. A little bit of a passive move. I mean, the king wasn't really that vulnerable on the g8 square, so he likely had better ideas in mind. And now Magnus jumps in with the queen to the f4 square. Surprisingly, a very good square for the queen in this position. Of course, that queen is putting pressure on the knight on the f6. White's threatening bishop takes, then queen takes. And of course, black can't move this knight on e7, which would open up the defense of the queen to the f6 square, because that knight has to defend c6 for now. So here, Alireza Firouzja, it's only move 17, and already he is in a world of trouble. All right, knight e8 is the move. This move technically defends f6, both with the knight and the queen can defend. But of course, the problem is this leaves the pawn on the c6 square vulnerable. And here, Magnus, he regains the lost pawn. And now look at this. All of Magnus Carlsen's pieces are just better placed than their black counterparts. I mean, Magnus with the pressure on the knight here, the strong pawn center, that Catalan-style bishop slicing through the board if he ever goes e5. It's incredible how Magnus always gets these dominant positions. Now, Alireza Firouzja, queen b6, putting pressure on the knight, and Magnus jumps in with the queen to the d6 square. Now, this is a very committal move. Of course, the queen can be attacked by various pieces here, perhaps knight e8, perhaps rook d8 in the future if that knight on c6 isn't there anymore. However, here, Magnus is confident the queen on d6 is okay for now. Now, Alireza Firouzja, bishop b7, good move, finally getting the bishop into the game and challenging White's bishop on the g2 square if White ever goes e5, as he did literally on the next move. All right, e5 by Magnus Carlsen. Of course, queen b6 already on the board, meaning the knight on f6 is not pinned to the queen. Therefore, the knight is allowed to move. And let's see what happens here. But first, Chess YouTube, if you're enjoying this video, show me some love. Smash that like button. It's the #1 thing you can do to help me reach more people. All right, back to the game. Now here, black. Bishop takes c6 on the board. Bishop takes. Of course, now Magnus threatening the rook on the a8 square. It's got to go somewhere. It goes to d8. Rook a d8. Now Magnus Carlsen's queen is being attacked. And this is one of those scenarios we talked about where maybe Magnus Carlsen's queen could be in trouble. Of course, if the queen goes away too far, say to the b4 or a3 squares, that bishop on c6 is going to fall. Therefore, the only really good idea is perhaps queen c7 or queen c5, maintaining the defense of that bishop on the c6 square. So, queen c5 on the board, and here Alireza finally trades queens. Queen takes, d takes, then h6, putting the question to the bishop. Of course, the bishop was pinning the knight to the rook. Here, if the knight moves, say, knight to e8, then the rook on the d8 square falls, and that is game over. So, instead, you have to go h6 immediately, as Alireza Firouzja played in the game, putting the question to the bishop. Now, technically, e takes f6 is playable, but the position is very, very complicated after, say, e takes f6, h takes g5, and this is not really what Magnus Carlsen wanted in this game. He's already in complete control, so with that in mind here, bishop c1. Just retreating the bishop back to the c1 square, perfectly fine idea, and now he maintains the advantage in this position. All right, black, knight d5, getting the knight out of the attack of the pawn and centralizing the knight. Very good move. Now Magnus Carlsen takes the pawn on the b5 square, finally winning back that pawn. And now, after all these moves, we finally have even material. So, let's do a head count. Both sides have the two rooks, a bunch of pawns. The main imbalance is going to be White's bishop pair, that bishop on b5 and c1 versus black's two knights. Now, the bishop pair is definitely stronger than the two knights in a relatively open position, and it's very likely if some of these pawns fall on the c5, c4, and c3 squares, that the position will open up, so the bishops are quite a bit stronger here. And beyond that, White does have the better rooks, fewer pawn weaknesses. White has pressure on a7, so overall, Magnus Carlsen definitely in control here. Now here in this position, black, of course, can take the pawn on the c3 square. That is what he does. Alireza Firouzja, knight takes c3, hitting the bishop on b5 and forcing bishop takes c4 by Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, he's doing relatively okay despite his small disadvantage versus Magnus. But here he plays a very weak move, rook d4. This move is actually a little bit of a blunder. It gives Magnus a huge advantage, and Magnus finds the best move. Bishop to a6. From here, you are blocking that pawn on the a7 square, and the bishop controls c8, meaning c6, c7, c8, promoting to a queen on the c8 square is a very big threat for Magnus Carlsen. All right, Alireza Firouzja, knight d5, retreating the knight, trying to control that c7 square, stopping c6, c7 ideas. But here, Magnus Carlsen, c6 anyway, he's going for it. All right, Alireza Firouzja, knight g to e7, developing the knight, but then bishop a3, pins the knight to the rook. If the knight moves anywhere, say knight takes c6, white is going to win that rook on f8, so that is not a possibility. Here, Magnus again maintaining the pressure. All right, rook e8 by Alireza Firouzja defends the knight and gets the rook out of that pin on the f8 square. Now rook fc1 by Magnus, bolstering that pawn on c6, and now once again c7 and then c8, promoting to a queen is a real threat. For that reason here, Alireza Firouzja has to retreat the knight. Knight to c7, blocking the pawn on c6 and hitting that bishop on a6. So Magnus, he retreats the bishop back to the best square. Bishop to f1. From here, that bishop has access to that Catalan square, g2, and from there it will support the pawn on the c6 square very, very nicely. All right, here, Alireza Firouzja, knight d5, jumping in with the knight. Magnus goes bishop c5, hitting the rook on d4. The rook's got to go somewhere. It goes rook d2, but then rook takes a7. Magnus wins the pawn on the a7 square and pressures that knight on c7. Where's the knight going to go? Well, the truth is that knight has to stay there. If it goes anywhere, sooner or later, Magnus is going to push c7 and threaten c8, promoting to a queen. So, therefore, rook c8 is the best move, defending the knight and maintaining the blockade of the pawn. All right, now Magnus, bishop d6, pressuring the blockading piece. Very good idea. And now Alireza Firouzja makes a little bit of a mistake here. f5, expanding on the king's side. However, Magnus doesn't care. He just takes on f6. Black takes back. And here, Black's pawn structure on the king's side is quite a bit weaker. Now, the main advantage of this sequence for Black is it does remove the pawn on the e5 square, and that pawn was bolstering the bishop on d6. So now after e takes, g takes, suddenly the bishop on d6 is a little bit more vulnerable, but overall here Magnus still in complete control. It continues bishop to h3, putting pressure on that newly weakened e6 pawn with the bishop. All right, knight b5, forks the rook and the bishop on d6, but Magnus rook d7 defends the rook as well as the bishop. Now knight b6 once again hitting the rook. What's Magnus going to do? Here he just goes bishop to f4, getting the bishop out of the attack of the knight and the rook and putting pressure on Black's rook on d2. So Magnus saw through all of these tactics. He finds the right solution. Now here, some of the pieces come flying off the board. We have rook takes d7. Magnus obviously recaptures with the c-pawn. C takes d7. Then rook takes c1. Bishop takes c1. Knight takes d7. And then finally the pawn on the e6 square is also hanging. Bishop takes e6. And now we simplify into an endgame with two bishops versus the two knights, and white has the pawn majority on the king side, and Black's pawns on f6 and h6 are also very weak in this position. So Magnus, again, in complete control. He should be able to convert this advantage. However, there is a lot of work to be done in this position. All right, Alireza Firouzja, he starts knight c5, hitting the bishop. Bishop c4, hits the knight on b5. We're going to have a lot of these skirmishes coming up. Now, knight d6 hits the bishop, bishop f1 finally retreats, and king g7 activating the king. Now, bishop a3 hitting both the knight on c5 and the knight on d6. The knight moves, defending the other knight. Then bishop g2, pressuring the knight on b7, as well as maintaining pressure on the knight on d6. Now, neither knight can really move. Or can they? Well, Alireza Firouzja finds knight to c4, giving up the defense of this knight on b7, but also pressuring the bishop on a3. Here, if Magnus takes the knight on b7, then knight takes a3, gets rid of a pair of minor pieces, and here Black's going to have a much, much easier time defending as Magnus no longer has that bishop pair. So instead, with that in mind, bishop c1 on the board by Magnus. Of course, c1, a very good square for the bishop, cutting off all of these squares for the Black knight. Now, knight c5, jumping in with the knight. Bishop f1, pressures the knight on c4. Knight e5, king g2 by Magnus. Knight e4, bishop b2, pressuring the knight on e5, knight d6, retreating, bishop e2. Again, good square for the bishop, being 3 files away, blocking all of these squares. And now knight to b7 by Alireza Firouzja. And here Magnus Carlsen, he starts to expand on the king side. This is a very, very key move for Magnus in this position. f4, expanding, setting up king f3 ideas, and knocking off that knight from the very well-placed e5 square. Now knight to f7, king f3, knight c5, king e3, knight d6, and here Magnus makes a little bit of a mistake. He expands on the king side with the move g4, and this looks very, very logical. Obviously, Magnus Carlsen is trying to expand on the king side of this position. However, here, Alireza Firouzja, if he finds it, he has the key move h5, immediately disrupting White's pawn structure. If Black found this, it would have made his defense that much easier. Instead, he does not find it, or he does not see the strength of the move. Instead, knight to e6 on the board by Alireza Firouzja, and he misses his chance. Now, bishop a3 pressures the knight on d6, knight f7 on the board, king e4, and here finally Alireza goes h5 with that idea we saw earlier, but he had to play it a couple moves prior. Here is not nearly as strong. Magnus ignores the threat of h takes g4 and just goes bishop c4, trying to put pressure on that knight on e6 and the one behind it on the f7 square. Now, knight e d8 defends the knights, but then g takes h5. Magnus here, he wins a pawn. Now, of course, White's pawn structure on the king side is a little bit weaker now, but a pawn is a pawn, and this does help Magnus. Now, Alireza Firouzja, knight to h6, blocking the pawns, king d5, further activating the king, and knight to f5 by Alireza Firouzja, targeting the weak pawn on the h4 square. All right, bishop d3 hits the knight, Alireza takes the pawn, then bishop e7 hitting the knight and that pawn on f6, which currently is defended by the king, but Magnus just increasing the pressure. Now, knight to f7, king e6, Magnus further activating the king. Now, knight g2 targets the pawn on the f4 square. I can't draw arrows on the f4 square. Now, bishop takes f6, king h6, and f5. Magnus, he is giving up the pawn on the h5 square in order to push this pawn down the board as quickly as possible. And now, real fast, I do want to point out, here Magnus, he could have simply won the knight on the f7 square. King takes f7. However, he didn't go for this, as here in this position, Black can do something like knight takes f4, then gobbling up the pawn on the h5 square, and it's not immediately obvious if Magnus Carlsen is going to be able to win this endgame with the two bishops versus the knight. Of course, the two bishops can deliver checkmate, but Black has the extra knight, and that knight may be able to help Black hold on for a long, long time. So instead, Magnus goes f5 in this position, trying to keep more tension in the position. Now, knight to f4, king takes f7 finally, and then knight takes d3. So Magnus giving up the bishop on the d3 square, winning the knight on the f7 square, and now his main idea is pushing the c-pawn down the board, promoting to a queen. Of course, if Alireza Firouzja ever wins that pawn on f5 with the knight, after he also captures this pawn on the h5 square, Magnus cannot deliver checkmate with just a king and a bishops. That will be a draw. So Magnus here, if he wants to win the game, he has to keep at least one pawn alive in this position. All right, Magnus, bishop d4, retreats the bishop, king takes h6, and then f6. That was the idea of bishop d4, freeing up the f6 square for the pawn. Now, f6 on the board, knight to f4, king e8, knight g6, f7. Magnus, he is one square away from promoting. However, the knight does control that square, meaning f8 right away will not work. Black just sacrifices the knight, kamikaze style, and he draws the game. So instead, king g5, king d7 for Magnus Carlsen, king f5 for Alireza Firouzja, bishop g7, both sides kind of sharking around. This is technically a drawn position, but Magnus is trying to eke out a mistake by Alireza Firouzja. Now, king g5, king e6, knight f4 check, hits the king has to move, king d6, knight g6, king d7, king f5, king d6, king g5, king e6, and finally here in this position, Black makes a mistake. The key move, believe it or not, is going to be knight to f4, hitting the king. That's the only move to stay in the game. Instead, king to h5 on the board, and here Magnus, he spots the error of this. King to f6, and now look at this. If the king moves, say to g4 or h4, Magnus Carlsen wins the knight, then promotes, and he wins the game. Therefore, knight to f4 is forced. This is all Alireza Firouzja can do. And now Magnus Carlsen, he promotes to a queen on the f8 square. He has a queen and a bishop versus the knight. By all means, this is a one position with Magnus Carlsen. But Magnus Carlsen, he has literally seconds left on the clock. Can he win? All right, king g4, king e5 by Magnus Carlsen, threatening queen takes f4, and then checkmate soon after. Here, Alireza Firouzja, knight g6, forking the queen and the king. Magnus, king to d4. Now, if Alireza Firouzja takes on the f8 square and Magnus takes back, this would be an immediate draw as neither side has enough material to deliver checkmate. But instead, Alireza Firouzja, in this position, he plays the greatest swindle move of all time, knight to h4. Magnus Carlsen did not expect this. It took him too long to react, to play the move, say, queen to f4, delivering check on the black king. And in this position right here, Magnus Carlsen lost on time to Alireza Firouzja. Wow, what an incredible game. Magnus Carlsen losing on the clock in the very end of the game in a winning position by any stretch of the imagination. All right, Chess YouTube, what did you think of today's video? Leave your comment in the comment section below. And while you're at it, make sure you like the video, and I'll see you in the next video.